Good evening. My name is Ryan Isaac. I am the Director of Cultural Arts at the San Diego Center for Jewish Culture at the Lawrence Family JCC Jacobs Family Campus. Welcome to our conversation with Emmy-nominated comedy writer Bess Kalb. Bess is the author of Nobody Will Tell You This But Me, a true as told to me story, and best-selling author at that. She's joining us courtesy of the Jewish Book Council, so a special thank you to everyone at the JBC. Tonight we will hear from Bess about a wide range of topics, including her book, her career as a comedy writer, and parenting in a pandemic. As many of you know, this season we are presenting all of our programs for free. During these times, we believe that the arts are more important than ever, and we want to make experiencing them as easy as possible. I would like to thank the underwriters of the 2020-2021 season. Without your support, none of this is possible. If you enjoyed today's program, I ask that you please consider donating at lfjcc.org/arts. This season is also presented in partnership with the Hive at Leechtag Commons. Our friends at the Hive also believe in sharing the Jewish cultural arts with as many people as possible. Together, we are working to deliver meaningful programming to a larger audience. Again, Nobody Will Tell You This But Me is the book. It's a New York Times editor's choice, and now it's out in paperback. It's my pleasure to welcome Bess Kalb.
Hello, thank you so much. It's so great to be here.
It's great to have you, Bess.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I was sitting there excited for the talk myself.
That's good. That's what we try to do.
I was like, I want to know about parenting.
At least two of us excited then.
Yeah.
Bess, is your video on?
Yes. Is it not showing up for you?
Okay, not for me, but
Yep. Oh, I see myself. It says on the air.
Good enough.
I see myself in a tiny box.
Oh, there you are.
There, yeah.
Hey. Hello.
Hi.
How's everything going? How have you been?
You know, every day is a trial by fire, and I'm hanging in there. I think the most honest answer any parent in a pandemic, we spoke briefly before. I know you have a young child. It's sort of like today was fine. So fine.
Right.
Tomorrow might be very different. Yesterday was different. Exactly. Yesterday we learned yesterday we learned how to stomp our foot and say no. So yesterday was bad.
Right. Great. Well.
Oh, look, there we are.
Now we're together. There we go.
There we are.
So
great.
The book has been out. Have you been on virtual book tour the entire time?
I have been doing a book tour from the comfort of my home office. It's exciting to do a talk when my child is asleep, because there will be very likely, of course I say that, but no interruptions. Doing this entire tour from home has been, in one way, a blessing. I've been able to reach far more people than I would have in an in-person tour, especially thanks to the Jewish Book Council. The various JCCs and JCC affiliated organizations that I've spoken to have taken me all over the place. It's nice to be speaking with a community close to home, close to where I am in LA. But I've spoken to over 40 Jewish Book Council affiliated organizations, and it has been so great. It has been my tether to. It's been like my reason to, put on my tinted lip balm. It's been great.
Right.
Yeah. It's been a real beacon of sanity in this pandemic, but it has fully just been at home. And as somebody who's not a performer and not somebody who necessarily feels comfortable sitting in front of an audience of more than like 3 people, this has been great.
But you miss out though on the travel, which would give you some better sleep, a little more uninterrupted, nights.
Oh God, what I wouldn't do for just like a days in a town where no one can reach me.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the book a little bit. I really enjoyed it, and yeah. I was surprised because I feel like it was marketed in a clever way where the first thing I knew about it was that you'd saved all of the voicemails from your grandmother over the years. And I didn't expect the depth. I didn't expect the narrative. When did this idea come to you first?
Excuse me, I'm just gonna have my water.
Sure.
I'm speaking to you from pollen season. And so I drink about 4 of these giant things a day because I'm coughing so much. But the idea came to me, and by the way, I'm glad to hear that you were surprised, and I also was sort of mindful of the fact that it seemed a little gimmicky in the sort of marketing material. This is by no means, for those of you who've read it, forgive me, you know this, but it's by no means sort of like a coffee table flip through, a sort of like stuff my grandma says shtick with this sort of caricature of an older Jewish woman. This really is a love letter to the woman who helped raise me, and I can show you this since you mentioned the voicemails, and I'm feeling like I know you follow my Twitter. I can show you something that I wouldn't be able to show in a in-person event. I can show you all of the voicemails on the very phone in front of me. I'll wait till the light balance, but here's in the digital flesh everything that is in the book. I to this day have them on this phone that I have now because I insist that everything is uploaded onto the new device, and it is a real act of digital hoarding that I've done. But I started doing that when my grandmother started getting sick, started getting really sick, and there was just something very final and almost barbaric about the idea of swiping to delete an artifact of her voice, because her voice is my greatest treasure that I didn't create with my own body. It really, these voicemails are all I have left of her, and the way that she really was. And the idea to write this book, and the idea to turn this sort of strange act of sort of ram clutter into a book is entirely out of grief. I started writing this book, I guess, at her funeral, at my grandmother's funeral. I was sort of having a usual struggle about not knowing what to write when I was tasked with writing and delivering her eulogy. And I ended up waking my husband up at 2 a.m. at this hotel in Boston the night before her funeral. And I said, what do you think if I just did it as her? If I just did one of the voicemails, would that be in poor taste? And he was like, potentially, yes. What are you talking? Like, it's not the You Show. Like, calm down. Just be like, beloved grandmother, she will be missed. And I was like, trust me, I've got this. And so I got up there and I read, I wrote out and then read one of the stories that's in this book. It's the story about how she would fly up to take care of me when I was an infant, when my mom went back to her medical residency when I was a few weeks old, and how she made this great schlep, how she went from Florida to New York and sat in their horrible small apartment by the hospital. She got her dig in there at my parents', and she, how she held me and how she took care of me. And it was this story that she told my voicemail to sort of dig the knife in about living so far away. She ended it with move back to New York by the end of the year. And that experience of reading that, I looked out into this extremely tough crowd, and my grandpa, who was, by far the most, to this day, stricken by grief and rocked by her loss, was laughing. My family was looking at each other and laughing, and they felt like she was there. And so I was like, wow, I have channeled her. This was not a transcript of a voicemail. This was me sort of doing a voicemail, the way that she would leave them, including I have to go, that's my call waiting. And then, hi, anyway. And so that's where this book started. It started on the dais at the Martha's Vineyard Hebrew Center. And then months later, this is a very long answer, I'm sorry. But
good answer.
Oh, good. Okay. Months later, I was in contact with a very brilliant, very kind literary agent, this woman named Erin Malone, who had followed me on Twitter and was sort of like, do you have a book in this? Is there and I was like, no, I find that to be a really, that doesn't feel like a book. It is what it exists as. And I was really avoiding doing that. And she said, send me something. And I said, okay, my grandmother died in March and I've been writing as her nonstop on a Microsoft Word document called Grandma. And it's stories that she told me and it's conversations we had. And I've just been sort of putting her down on this sort of digital page. And it's 45 pages long. And I'm sorry, please ignore this. I literally ended it with like, please disregard Bess. And she emailed me back an hour later and said, holy shit, I'm so sorry. But she said, holy shit, this is a book. And she saw it immediately. And this is somebody who is not Jewish, was not close with her grandparents, and just saw something universal in it. And I'm so grateful. She was the first reader of every manuscript and had such incisive, brilliant notes. And she really brought this into being. So that is the long and somewhat profane, I apologize, it's been a day, story of how this book came to be.
No, you're entitled. And I am so happy that you brought up the U word, universality. That was like, I got that 15 pages in last night, and then I had to pause and wonder, is this universal to all, or just because I had a grandmother very similar? It was Nordstrom instead of Bloomingdale's.
Nordstrom. We were equal opportunity department store people.
she was shoes instead of hats. But
okay.
Then I started to think, like, is this the way that generation of Jews, our grandparents who had some disposable income, dealt with their problems? Like, it was like, my grandma loved to, like, here's the credit card, go. Like, if I can't go with you, go. It's important that you look like a mensch.
That's so sweet. That's such a sweet thing.
I was experiencing that when reading the book and just wondering, like, am I the only one who would connect in this way? And I think the answer is no. I think the agent really proves that.
Yeah, she does. Thank God, she did. And I mean, this is also why I love the Jewish Book Council. It's because it's like, I talk about universality and that's all important, but it's like, these are my people, and these people, this grandmother, like, you've actually had this grandmother.
Right.
And I wrote this book for people who really, really got my grandma. And people who were sort of like finishing her sentences because they had been said to them so many times. And it is a specific type of Jewish woman who has existed only in caricature and as like comedic, as sort of like a punchline, and not in this sort of multifaceted, flawed, full heroic, give her the novelistic treatment, give her this podium as the main character in a novel about a Jewish family. And so I'm glad about that. But my first reader outside of my reluctant husband, who was like, yeah, I know you've been talking about her nonstop. Thank you. Yes, we are living in your grief. Okay. But aside from him and Aaron, I sent the full manuscript to my very dear friend who is a Marvel Comics geek and grew up evangelical in Northern California, in super, super rural California. One of these families where The Simpsons and Harry Potter were considered satanic. And he defected and became a Hollywood comedy writer. But after reading The Origin of Species, he's a far more fascinating person. And now he's writing Ant-Man. So good for Jeff. But he was a Kimmel writer with me, and we shared a windowless office for like 5 years. We breathed the same air. Everything that went through either of our brains went through the other person. And I sent this to Jeff, who never met a grandparent and never met a Jew before he moved to Hollywood. And he was like, this rocked me. And so I'm on the one hand very, very glad to speak to an audience of, I presume, people who have met a Bobby Bell or have had a Bobby Bell, or at least, maybe even been yelled at by a Bobby Bell. But
there might be some Bobby Bells.
There might be some Bobby. That's the best part. It's, when I've done these events and it's in Zoom, I always put it in gallery mode, always, because I don't need to see this, but I feel like I'm talking to my grandma sometimes. And so that's been a very nice part of this.
That is nice. I was going to ask about writing the book in the process of grieving. Now having a better understanding of where you started, obviously was or is a huge part. And I'm also not just for you, but how about for the rest of your family? This seems to have.
Yeah, idea of the book and really just sort of the pure act of writing the book initially was a private grieving exercise. It just was the way that I needed to commit my grandma to the page and to feel like I was, as best I could, remembering everything she told me before she disappeared. And there's a Jewish saying that it's you die twice, and it's the first time you die, and then the next death is when the last person who remembers you dies. And the idea that no one would remember her eventually was deeply unsettling. It is going to happen, to everyone. But the idea that I could just make her hold on a little bit longer by writing this book was really important. And as an artifact of her, it's important to the rest of my family because they feel a little less crazy for missing her because now all of these people are in love with her, or at least know about her, and feel what they felt, which is somebody who is really, really good at loving despite herself. And I also say in the author's note in this book, something that is, it really should be upfront in the book, which is this is not an objective journalistic account of her life. This is a matrilineal love story about the only daughter of an only daughter of an only daughter. And my grandmother had 7 grandchildren, and she loved them equally and ferociously. And each of them have a book like this to tell. But the reason they're not in this is it's I don't have license to tell those stories. I wouldn't presume to be inside those relationships. This is just our relationship. But the most important audience for this book, even more important than Jeff, is my grandpa. And his reaction to the book was the one that everything hinged on for me. And to give you an idea of what happened when the book was published, my grandpa had a stack of copies of this book, of the hardcover, of Nobody Will Tell You, this stack of this on the doorman's counter in the lobby of his apartment building in Florida. And they were all signed with his signature. Like, you want a Hank Bell original? You should see me, page 45 to 62. It's me. It's Hank. My picture's in there a couple times. He was so proud, and his first, direct reaction to it before it was published, when I sent him an early draft of the manuscript, was thank you. So that's how it was received.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Was there a lot of research that had to go in on your part?
Yes, that I love talking about. And that's a great question, because this is not just sort of this divine, and then it poured out of me and I had this channeling. No, I had to get it right. And I had to talk to family members to make sure that I was getting it right. I was a witness to the part of the book. There are 4 sections in it. It's my mother, your mother, our life together, and after me. And our life together is what I was the authority on. You know what? I was half the authority on. I was speaking for her and for myself. But the my mother and your mother, my mother, I interviewed my Uncle Georgie's surviving daughter, Jeannie, about it, my, I guess, great cousin, second cousin. And I talked to my grandfather at length. I have on my iTunes, I have hours of spiels of him going into each aspect that was described, their meeting and he actually doesn't know about that, but the proposal, where they lived, his business, all of this. And then my mom was sort of the 11 p.m. phone call when I would be writing after work and say hey, the Mexico story, what happened with the Chicago 7 petition? You mentioned there was a medication that happened when you were a kid. What was that? My mom was the primary source for the most emotionally important part of the book, which is the part called Your Mother, which explains how close we were, because she failed so spectacularly in so many ways as a mother, even though she, in reality and from 30,000 feet away, was extraordinarily loving and extraordinarily ambitious for her daughter. There was friction and there was combustibility, and I needed to really make sure I got that right. So I went to the sources, and the sources were my family.
That's great. Well, the tone definitely changed.
Yes. I should also mention, and I have it here, this is another kind of nifty, they're all on the floor, but to get the pogrom part right, I actually took essentially a college course in Shtetl 101. Here, I'll show you these books. Okay. We've got I have to be careful not to pull up good night construction site, but which is also on the floor. This is, Becoming Soviet Jews is a book that's a translation that ended up, if you've read the book, then the story of my great grandmother's escape from the pogroms in the Pale of Settlement to the United States, to Ellis Island, is sort of an explanation for who my grandma is. And I found out about what life was actually like in Belarus through this one. The Atlas of Jewish history is sort of each page is an entire Game of Thrones season of like how someone could walk from here to and then end up there. It has this sort of the entire diaspora, and it's fascinating. And it taught me about the trajectory of my great grandmother. The Jews of Eastern Europe. This was how did being Jewish become illegal? It's like, well, kosher food was made illegal, so they were starved, and taxes were put on Talmud, and it was illegal to read Torah in school, so you became illiterate. And understanding the hardship, understanding the history was and then Pogrom by Steve Zipperstein for just sort of like the tragedy and understanding the mortal terror that must have been felt, and also some Isaac Bashevis Singer for color. But I wanted to make sure I wasn't giving sort of a Fiddler on the Roof account of what my great grandmother went through. I needed to understand what that escape that so many American Jews ended up making, what that immigrant experience was like. I read congressional testimony from Italian immigrants who sailed on the steamships with Jews and gave this very brave testimony about like, we had it rough, but the way that they would serve the kosher food, like slop for animals, was so I did all of that during the first trimester of my pregnancy. And so I was like weeping and like feeling the plight of my great grandmother while being like, am I hormonal, or is this really getting to me? The answer is both. So that's the research.
That's great. We have a very thriving adult Jewish education department at RJ, and you're gonna come down as a guest lecturer.
Oh my goodness, I would love to. I have this information. I read so much, and it was just it was like a scant 20 pages. But I could write I wanted to write. I didn't want to embellish more than I needed to. This was the story that needed to happen and fit within the narrative. But I think what shameful for me is that I was never taught. I had to teach myself this. This was just not taught in schools.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to Rodef Shalom in New York City. I went to a Jewish early childhood education program, but I didn't learn about it. So I'm sure there are people who are watching who know far more than I do. But at least I gave myself a sort of crash course in where I and we come from.
That's great. I think that's some of the universality too. Without that foundation and the learning behind it, I don't know if you'd have the way to kind of weave it all together. So
totally, yeah. It's I needed to sort of over prepare to get it half right, and that's what I was trying to do.
You mentioned being in the first trimester while writing, and I saw at the end of the book in the acknowledgments, you thanked your son for behaving. You also thanked Jimmy Kimmel for showing you how to work hard and do everything at once.
Yes.
And between the Kimmel quote and the thanks that you gave to Kimmel and to your son, I'm wondering how intertwined those two are, and what that was like. What did Jimmy teach you, and what did you have to do to get this done?
Yeah, I mean, as intertwined as they are, Jimmy kept saying throughout my pregnancy, he was like, James is a good name. It's a strong name. And I was like, yeah, that would be super weird. But the whole idea of being able to be a writer who actually writes is something I learned from Jimmy. When you are training as a writer, as a late night writer, you have to fill the prompter every single day. You have to fill the page. There's no such thing as writer's block. I can't wander around a house being like, oh, the muses aren't speaking to me. No, you have to deliver. It's like your job is to have a certain amount of material submitted to the head writers and to Jimmy every day. And then if a significant amount of that isn't good, you just get fired. That's how late night works. Like you need to be having 3 solid jokes per monologue per day. And your batting average is something that everyone knows because jokes are public. Your initials are over every joke that gets, so it's like it's this kind of like gun to your head trial by fire writing training where when I have an editor be like, so you have a year to write this book and to submit your manuscript, and this is your deadline for the first third, and then here's your next deadline the next. It's like she ended up writing me. She was like, hey, in my entire career as an editor, nobody has met their deadlines. That's never happened once. And I was like, I missed a friend's wedding because it was the weekend of the first deadline. And later, and by the way, they still are like, oh, she was on book deadline. But so if they're watching, Steve and Abby, I love you so much. I'm so sorry. Charlie went in my stead and he's much more fun than I am anyway. So, but yeah, I was trained as a writer by Jimmy and by that show. And he also is the type of person who has never slacked at anything. Just like if he does something, he's going to do it in a way that like he'll meet the expert on it. If it's like cooking, if it's fly fishing, he'll do the thing exactly spectacularly, and especially with comedy. This is like a man who has gotten to the place that he is in his career by demanding the same level of work from his employees that he shows. And this is a boss who, when we would go on these hiatuses from the show, which is when I wrote the book, we would get emails being like, hey, what do you guys think about this idea for like a longer form sketch, like a more of a moonshot thing? And we'd all have to be like, he does not unplug. He's just always doing it. And you have to be that way. And so how to work hard and do everything at once is probably the most concise way to describe my boss and mentor and somebody whose validation I sought every day of my life for 8 years. And so when he read this book, and I wrote him a note in it that was like, it would be my honor if he read 10 pages and threw it in the garbage. And he read it and then wrote this long reaction to it. And I printed it out like a sap, and I framed it. It's hanging in my office. And I told him that. He was like, I used lowercase letters for sentences. So, yeah, I mean, this is somebody who is an expert at what he does and taught me. And the head writers of the show, his wife, Molly McNierney, who is co-head writer, and Gary Greenberg taught me, how to actually deliver and how to write and make yourself access the part of you that can write, even when you feel like you can't.
That's incredibly interesting, especially thinking about you writing this book, coming at it as a joke writer by day, where, and that's, I don't know enough about it, but just joke writing versus comedy writing are two completely different.
You need to be, they are very different, but you have to fundamentally be a joke writer. Like if you watch an episode of Veep, you're like, oh, these are surgical joke writers. It's like the economy of words, the construction is just that's like impeccable top of the field. And you also have to have an ear for story. And that's where comedy writing comes in. And that's why narrative and scripted is different and more impressive than late night. And so I was really scared, especially in the back of my head, should I just do the gimmick book? Should I just do here are my grandma's voicemails and our funny conversations, which, by the way, a lot of that initial 45-page dump that I gave Erin was the shorter form stuff, was the voicemails and the conversations. I felt like a fraud being like, well, how do I do the prose, the soaring prose that ultimately is the heart of this book? And so I had to unlearn a little bit of you have your punchline, you move on to the entirely separate next thought, often about an entirely separate subject. And so I had to be a little bit better at weaving together comedy and story and pathos. And it turned into the type of writing that's much closer to who I am than comedy writing is. I thought like, oh, am I going to be posturing? Am I this fraud? Like I'm posturing as a writer. Like who the hell do I think it's like, what, you're not Didion, like calm down. And then I realized I'm certainly not Didion, but this character, the character of Bobby Bell is so much closer to me than the character of Jimmy Kimmel that I was writing for. And the voice of Bobby Bell and the voice of this character is something I could do for 250 pages and not just like 2 jokes, sometimes 5 in a 22-minute monologue. It ended up being incredibly second nature to write this book. It is the book that I have always had in me. And I found it shockingly easy to do, even as emotionally taxing as it was.
So
but in terms of the craft, that did come naturally.
Yeah. Was it cathartic to get to the end?
Very. It was probably the most cathartic experience I've ever had. And I wrote the ending of the book. This is something that I actually haven't. I wrote the ending of the book about halfway through writing the book. I wrote what is now the sort of the goodbye, the sending off that happens in the last 10 pages. And I wrote it and I wept in a way that I really didn't do it's very pretentious, and I'm like, and I brought myself to tears. But no, I was thinking about my grandma in this very intimate way. I was writing as her dying and going through the process of accepting her life and passing on her stories and explaining to me why I was writing this book. And at her funeral, I wasn't sobbing. I wanted to hold it together for my grandpa and for my little brother and, my mom. I'm not somebody who will like do a big public display of emotion. I was there to be with the family and grieve. And, I cried, but I didn't do this sort of like crazy snot sob at the funeral. And writing this last part was that sort of animalistic, howly crying that I really probably had needed to do since the Shiva. And I just sort of really, really used the well of sadness that I had and separated it completely from this like intellectual idea of the book about her and just put it all on the page. And so that was both very necessary in terms of the arc of this book and having an end to the book, but entirely transformative in terms of my experience of grief and grief about her. So yes, catharsis with a capital C.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so are there, during the pandemic, creatively, what have you been doing? Has it been, I mean, obviously you got a baby.
I got a baby. Well, he's 19 months old, so he's an adult now.
Right.
He's going to Brown. And he, what is it?
The legacy.
It's double legacy. So if he doesn't get into Brown, then we've got a real idiot on our hands. But as he like bumps into a wall and drools, we're like, he's double legacy. No, and double legacy is a huge problematic thing, and hopefully that counts less for. He should go exactly where he's happy. He should go to a school that is entirely plastic dump trucks, and that is his school.
That's Providence.
That's Providence for you. You've been to Providence.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, but I do think this has been an oddly productive year in terms of the work that I've been able to do. I'm very, very lucky that I have amazing childcare. They're 65 years old and they're my parents. And they haven't held a baby in 30 years. But they're free and they are here every day. And they love him unconditionally and they screw up. He's had to go to the emergency room twice. It's a nightmare, but it's free. And they're my parents and they love us. And so because he's been playing with my parents, I have been able to actually really work. And I've put him down for every nap and I'm there at every meal, but I can run into this office, which is on the other side of the rest of it's this office. And then on the other side of the door is living room, kitchen, eating area. Like the rest of the house is right on the other side. So I very quietly with sort of like I have this therapist white noise machine on the outside of the door that he thinks like takes mommy away. If that's on, like mommy isn't there. But which will make therapy a very complicated experience for him, I just realized. But I am able to ensconce myself in here, and I've done a comedy special for Amazon. I have sold a TV show, which is a very exciting thing. It's something that I have been working on and bothering Jeff about for years, and finally sold, and it's great. And it's a weird feminist Jewish show that takes place in biblical times, and it's a comedy. And I am co-writing the screenplay to Nobody Will Tell You This But Me, the adaptation for the film.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and none of these things are like, and all of these things are like, you have the potential to write something really good, but you're a small part of it. Like everyone's like, and you're just the writer at the end of all of these conversations. It's like, I'm like, ooh, who will play? And they're like, we won't tell you that. But I at least can like be behind my laptop being like, here are some lines I wrote. And it's very fun and rewarding because it's playing in a fantasy land that I've always wanted to live in.
That's great. The Amazon project, was that Yearly Departed?
That was Yearly Departed, yes.
That's an incredibly strong cast of hilarious, successful women.
Yes.
What was that like, being part of the production of it and head writing for that? Like what?
I pitched it. I sold it to it was, I was the executive producer of it with Rachel Brosnahan, the marvelous Mrs. Maisel herself, who is a delightful human, and on the Jimmy level of like someone who is to the minutia involved and right, and like spot on and has great instincts. And the experience of that was surreal and felt honestly like a prank because it happened over Zoom. And we put this all together remotely, and I hired my friends to write it, and it happened to be an all-female writer's room. And that was really great because I had been part of a writer's room that was very predominantly male for many years. And so didn't even know that you could have an all-female writer's room. And it ended up being fine. Nobody tripped and fell trying to print something. But I was gonna be like, nobody cried, but it's like, we cried. But I will say it was a surreal experience. I memorized Jesus' Magic my freshman year of college, Sarah Silverman's incredible seminal stand-up performance, her I guess stand-up special. I should know the lingo of these things. I really do sound like somebody who's never but her special was foundational for me, in that I ended up in a trailer, COVID tested with an N95, a visor, and rapid test that day, but that we were in a trailer together, and she was asking me to punch up her jokes and the jokes that I had written. And then she did a pass, and then she was like, does this work? And I had to look at her and be like, no, you have to reverse the setup and the punchline. And she was like, oh yeah. And then I was like, I know I don't need to win a Nobel Prize for medicine. That's it.
That's incredible. Well, we will make sure after the show sometime tomorrow to send to everybody who's here the link for that.
Oh,
and maybe we'll get the bibliography of your research as well.
I'll send it along to you. I have it in an email from another event. So remind me, or I have your email or somebody's. Sarah, I will make sure that it gets to you because it's a wild ride.
Okay, we got a question regarding that.
Oh, sorry.
The question from the audience that all of my grandparents were from Belarus. Which is the best book to read for that information?
Okay, well, welcome to Israel Bartok's The Jews of Eastern Europe. This is a book that gets specific about Minsk. Chapter, I can tell you the book and the chapter. So it's called Russia and the Jews. Chapter 5, and the place where I get really heavy-handed with underlining and sort of annotation happens about everything that happened in the Pale of Settlement, including Belarus, but not limited to, and then gets specific about Minsk and Pinsk and various other places. The other book, you know what, that I don't have here. Oh, yes, I do. This is a book that is entirely about Belarus. It is called Become. So I will say that this book was a lighter read, that or not lighter. It was intensely academic, but it was matter of fact about each thing that I needed to know. This book is more of a sprawling. I think you would have more of an enjoyable time reading this. It's called Becoming Soviet Jews: The Bolshevik Experiment in Minsk, and so it is a micro local account of what Belarus was like at the time when my ancestors came over, and in the 1880s, which is after the Tsar Alexander II's assassination, when Jews, of course, were blamed. And so it was what happened after that specific event in this specific place. It ended up not being the most useful text for my book because my story didn't take place in Minsk, but in terms of a broader understanding, it was illuminating and terrifying and familiar sounding. Yeah,
Great.
And I can hold it slowly if I don't mean to.
No, that's okay.
If you want to. I believe the author is Alyssa something. Oh, Elissa Bemparad. Elissa Bemparad. So now you have
I'll make sure that everybody who wants to know gets it. So thank you, Bess, for sharing that.
Of course.
A whole lot more than comedy tonight. We're diving deep into 1880s and Belarus.
Yeah.
Nothing funny from
no,
that.
There actually, it is the one time in history where there was absolutely nothing funny. It's where I come from. It's where we all come from.
Right. There you go. Anybody else who's out there who might have a question for Bess, whether it's about Jews immigrating or comedy, we've got a few minutes left, so feel free to put them in the chat. I do want to ask you, Bess, about your Twitter presence.
Sure.
You have a nice presence on there. I have noted over the months, you do well in the sarcasm and sometimes the smugness, and then it's great to watch people not pick up on it.
Oh gosh, yeah, I think thank you, thank you.
But then the thing is, the kicker is there ends up being some strange, not usually seen on Twitter, kindness that resolves it all.
As you can see, I have a lot of trouble being like a stern, serious person, even about my own very serious, profoundly serious thing. I also don't want to be mean to anyone. My greatest fear is that I have offended somebody. My phone today autofilled in a text to my dad about running 15 minutes late, autofilled sorry, and I just went with it. I sent it along because my phone knows that I'm like, even to my own father who like couldn't care less, like it felt like great, he'll do the crossword puzzle and like catch his breath. But I don't want to actually be mean to people. Having said that, there are people who are on social media, and without naming names because we've moved on as a nation, but there are people who approach social media with the kind of bullying and boorishness that it aims to offend. And when people respond to me unkindly, especially when it's about my child, who was used purely for comedic effect, as you now know, will have trouble going to, but will ultimately need a therapist. I get really defensive about that. And so if anybody like so much as, presumes to have something to say about who I am as a mother or who my child is, well, I'll eviscerate you and leave you for dead. Having said that, I'm a very nice person.
That's right. We got 2 questions in, and I think it's probably 2 great questions to wrap everything up with.
Sure.
I'm going to start with one from Ben Bass, who asks if you can briefly tell us about your path through comedy to the Kimmel Show.
Yes. It is a brief path. I was hired when I was 25 years old. I was a child. Um, I I was a comedy writer privately for if you've seen the movie Waiting for Guffman, there's a Eugene Levy line that I like to use, which is, I wasn't the class clown, but I studied him. And that's 100% I was like a very studious, very type A, kept my nose down. Like I didn't have a lot of friends growing up, just friends who like read the same historical fiction books as I did, and didn't play sports and wasn't popular. And I just read a lot and did my homework and like didn't want to disappoint my teachers. And and ultimately did when it came to physics and chemistry, but spectacularly. I still have nightmares. But the like id and outlet was always quietly writing comedy. And so I even wrote in my high school newspaper, of which I was the editor in chief. I had a pen name that was a boy's name, Seb Black, which is so lame because it's Bess Kalb backwards. This is very humiliating. And it was not a large school. But some people were like, we don't have a Seb Black here. And it's like, oh, Bess, what are you doing? But I would do like fake art reviews that were like parodies of art reviews, but like reviewing things around the school that were not art, but I thought were an installation. And like I would do these little comedy bits, but too scared to even use my own name. It never even occurred to me to write for the comedy magazine in college because it was all just like a bunch of Jewish guys named Ben. And then, but I would do these sort of like fake. I wrote for the RISD, the art school near us, Alt Weekly, because I had a crush on somebody, and that went nowhere. But I ended up writing, although he's married to a very nice man, that is true. But I ended up writing these comedy pieces for it, and it wasn't my school, and it was for a different crowd. And when I met my now husband and person with the baby monitor, I read him, not at all paying attention to him. I was just like, does this make sense? And I read him this comedy thing that I wrote, and he was like, oh, that's really funny. He didn't laugh, and I just hated him I was like, oh, you're you're surprised. And he was like, yes. And I realized like this is who I am. This is who this person sees me as. He has a Volvo. I'd like to impress him. An old station wagon. And seems nice. And so I decided like, fine, let me just lean into this and write under my own name. And it was because of Charlie that I started doing that. And I had this very serious job. I was a very serious journalist and was a fact checker for Wired magazine in San Francisco. And I was creatively the most stultified and sad I had ever been. Like my job was to correct actual writers and be like, according to the abstract of this paper, like this is this.
And your grandmother did not approve.
As you know, if you've read the book, yes. She was like, what the hell are you doing? But I was writing jokes on Twitter as this id release, fully for like 300 friends, like all people who I knew. One day, this comedian who is now a dear friend of mine retweeted a tweet of mine. And then it was around a time in like 2009 or so, 2010, when Follow Friday was a thing. And apologies if this is the real answer, and it's one that I don't really talk about, but I've talked about my grandma, so here we are. Follow Friday. And overnight, I had 1,000 followers. The comedian, by the way, is Rob Delaney, who, if you don't know, you should watch his beautiful show, Catastrophe, on Amazon. And he's a gentleman and a genuinely kind man, very good person. And I had 1,000 people following me, and I didn't know 1,000 people, and that felt like a threshold had been crossed. And then all of a sudden, I had these Letterman and SNL and Family Guy writers following me, like real comedy writers, like retweeting my stuff. My observations and my jokes. And one of them, this woman named Nell Scovell, who, if you've read the book, you know this story, DM'd me on Twitter and said, hey, like, who are you? I like your jokes. Come to LA, sleep on my couch. I want to introduce you to a bunch of people. And I was like, thank you so much. Have a nice day. That's so kind. Thank you for saying that. She was like, no, come. And I was like, I didn't like I had $124. I was like, I would love to. Thank you. I will think about it. And I finally like used enough. I got this ticket. I got to LA and I met these Family Guy writers and went to a Family Guy party, I guess, and saw this world. And for whatever reason, something in me was just like, this is exactly where I belong. Everything else is pretend. Um, and a year went by and nothing. And then I got a call from Nell and she said, Kimmel's looking to hire a writer. I found out from a friend of a friend, submit a packet through your agent. And I said, that's a very lovely thought. I do not have an agent. And she said, fine, I will submit the packet through my agent, because that was during a time, which is now, thank God, abolished, where you needed to submit through an agent. So thankfully, I had somebody who was willing to forward my packet to her agent, who for free submitted it. The packet got to Jimmy, and he was intrigued, and the head writers were intrigued, and they called me in. They had me punch up the packet in front of them. They pitched me news stories about John Boehner, about things that had happened that day. This was during the Obama-Romney election in 2012. Or the run up to it. And for whatever reason, I left. I don't know. I floated above my body. It was very Annie Hall. I had no idea what was happening in that interview. And I left and I called my mom and I said, I think I just got a job at Jimmy Kimmel Live. Then 8 years later, I left when I sold the movie rights to the book.
Wow.
Yeah, that's the story.
That's a great story. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Thanks for asking.
The other question, who did it come from? The comment, I loved your book so much and it made me think so much about memories. Do you think about how to capture memories of your parents for your kids, given your close relationship with your grandparents?
Yeah, that's a great, lovely question. I think we live in an age where of obsessive over documentation. And though I don't necessarily document my son on social media, my phone is just a psycho's. Like I have like I had to get a new phone to accommodate my rapacious need to just photograph my son constantly. And so much of it, because his nannies are my parents, so much of what my digital experience of life is pictures of them with him. And so there's this, I have a, as you know, need to like save and preserve memory and preserve these special moments. And so I found the digital to be a little bit ephemeral and scary. And what if the cloud disappears and I don't know what the cloud is? So I got a Polaroid camera and I have Polaroid actual physical pictures of my parents and my son everywhere. I don't want this book to put pressure on him to be like, now I have to write an ode to my grandfather. This is purely one insane woman's quest to deal with the loss of the inevitable, which is the death of a grandparent. But I do think it sets a tone in our family that we are to respect our grandparents and see them as whole people and not take them for granted. And not take advantage of them and not take advantage of their love and kindness, but to pay tribute to them and give something back to them as best we can. So hopefully that's what this book does for him.
That's great. Thank you. That was Allison Wolpoff. Thank you for that question. Usually Bess, we get to this point around 8 o'clock local time, and I'm bidding farewell to someone who's on the East Coast and staying up late. And here, I think for the first time in a while, we're actually, we're in the same state.
We're in the same state. This is
so
great.
Here we are. But I will let you go. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. This was great talking to you. Thank you for sharing everything with us. And again, to everybody who's been with us, we will send out some notes from the show with Bess's research, the various books in there, and some other items that she brought up. Don't forget the book now out in paperback as well. Nobody will tell you this but me, by the one and only Bess Kalb right here.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you so much. What a lovely conversation.
Thank you very much. And everybody, don't forget, coming up on Monday, Jacob Goldberg returns for his lectures, the lecture series on Monday and on Wednesday. You can register at lfjcc.org/Goldberg. So for more information, go there. Bess, once again, thank you and have a good evening. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.